So I have the pleasure of introducing Jessica, who is our preacher for today. Jessica Yamane is my partner of 7+ years. She's also a tia.
How many months?
4. Yes, 4. Okay. She's also a tia or an auntie for 2 children, 5 and under. She's a big sister to 4+ in-laws. She's a big cousin to 20+. Jessica grew up in a Baptist church, a historically Japanese American church in Los Angeles, California. And she returned to that church as an adult, where she was part of the leadership of the Open Door, a group of queer Christians and allies creating and at times demanding a space for true belonging in the church. In addition, Jess is an immigration attorney with Dolores Street Community Services. Her clients are immigrants who are detained in the Bay Area. She's working towards a day when all detention centers, today's concentration camps, are permanently and forever closed. Jess, it's an honor to introduce you, and we're so excited to hear from you.
Thanks, sweetie. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Jess.
Hi, Jessica.
Thank you all so much for being here. And I just want to shout out, because they just joined more recently, that all of my siblings and in-loves are on this call. My brother Danny, his fiance Inez Garzanidi, my sister Becky and her fiance Peter, and my 2 youngest sisters, Ronnie and Erica, and my good friend Nori, who helped me with this sermon. So thank you all for being here.
Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So let's launch. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I want to dedicate this sermon to my paternal grandfather, Edward Yamane. I knew my grandfather for many years of my life, yet his life remains mostly a mystery to me. For this reason, this sermon is filled with questions, and it is in many parts speculation, imaginings, and dreams. Before I begin, I want to ask you all to join me on this meditation with our ancestors. Who is someone that comes to you in your dreams, meditations, and prayers? This person doesn't have to be someone who is biologically related to you. It can be someone who you feel spiritually connected to, or someone that you draw inspiration from. Think about this and feel welcome to write these names into the chat box now. And while you all write those names, I'm going to just pray over this time. Dear God, I just thank you for this church, its generosity. Thank you for this process that you've taken me on, this internal conversation of writing not only to myself, but to my ancestors, to my grandfather with his complicated history. And I just pray that my words might flow from me today like a river. No forcing and no holding back. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
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 My grandfather passed away when I was 17 or 18 years old. In a baby book that my mom has passed on to me, she has glued a picture of my paternal grandfather and grandmother under the caption of Baby's Favorite People. I have many happy memories of my grandfather. He always set up the badminton net for us in the backyard when we would go over to visit. He drove the big family van to go peach picking, while Grandma and the grandkids snacked on Spam musubis in the back seats. His garage smelled like Home Depot, and he was always tinkering on something at his workbench. He was smart and handy, always around at family gatherings, and yet I don't remember ever having a single conversation with him. He was a man of very few words. My mom would say, "Go say hello to Grandpa," and I would go and hug his squishy belly and scamper off to play. During World War II, my grandfather was deployed to Europe. He fought in the 100th Battalion in C Company. And all but 3 of the men in that company were killed during the war. And my grandfather was one of those survivors. He saw many casualties. One of the few things that my father has told me about my grandfather is that when he would take off his shirt, you could see the scars from shrapnel wounds wrapping around his body like chains. The all-Japanese American battalions that fought during World War II, the 100th and 442nd Battalions, remain the most decorated units in US history to this day. My grandfather contributed to this trove of medals, earned literally through his blood. He was awarded a Purple Heart and a Silver and Bronze Star upon his return. Then, through the GI Bill, this country boy got an education. He became an engineer. He went on to work at JPL, and I think that he and my grandmother were among the first Japanese Americans to move into Monterey Park in Southern California. They did this at a time when there was still incredible prejudice against people of Japanese descent. My grandmother had 4 children, 3 of whom are alive and thriving to this day. So on the outside, my grandfather left behind an incredibly successful legacy. Let's weave into this setup the story of Rahab. Rahab was a sex worker, and I stumbled across her story only recently. I was never taught her story in any of my Sunday school classes as a child. I assume it's because, although children are ready, often adults aren't prepared to break down and discuss certain concepts, like sex and sex work. As an adult, I've realized that the Bible is full of mystery and contradiction. I understand now what they mean when they say it is a living text, but as a child, it was a black and white book of stories that laid down the rules. This past month, I read the story of Rahab for the first time. What we read in chapter 2 in the book of Joshua is that Rahab's home was built into the walls of Jericho, that she harbored and protected 2 Israelite spies, and that she gave them the words of encouragement that they needed to enter into the seemingly futile exercise of marching and screaming at the walls of Jericho. I paused to ponder how life was for Rahab after she delivered herself and her family from certain death. Did the Israelites embrace her willingly or begrudgingly? I ask you, how did Rahab live after Jericho's fall? Did she recreate her past? Did she lie and say that she had lived a different type of life? My partner, Ana, used to organize with sex workers in Guatemala. She started an empowerment center where the women could come to build community and to learn how to read and write. Most of these women were not from Guatemala. They were immigrants from El Salvador or Honduras. We read that Rahab lived in Jericho, but it's not clear that that's where she was from. Where do you feel like an outsider right now? Perhaps in this country, in your own family, within your own skin. The theme of this month's sermon series is whispers and shouts, and what is still whispered in my family is that my grandfather wreaked havoc in his own household. He was a broken man on the inside and very violent. I wonder if my grandfather ever forgave himself when he survived the war after so many of his comrades had died. I wonder if he was ever able to let go of a close-held fury at the United States, a country that had incarcerated its Japanese American citizens while sending others to serve as soldiers in defense of all the freedoms this country allegedly stood for. I wonder if he was ever able to mourn all that he had lost and to forgive himself. I have circled around and around the tidbits that I know from my grandfather's life, trying to better understand my grandfather, and by extension, my father, and by extension, myself. I've read a lot of other people's histories. I've pondered whether their narratives are similar to my own. I've pieced together a past from my grandfather, whether more imagined than real, that allows me to contextualize his actions and to forgive him. It took years, but I think that by the time I came around, my grandfather was more ready to forgive himself too. Also, I think that there is something redeeming and new about babies. They are wise, caring less about a person's past than how that person is with them in the present. My grandparents used to babysit me until I was around 1 year old, or maybe older. My auntie has recounted coming over to her parents' home and seeing me crawling around on the floor as an infant with my grandfather on his hands and knees playing with me. This image shocked her as it so wildly contradicted her conception of this man, her father. My grandfather used to put me on his back and walk the hilly streets of Monterey Park until I fell asleep. He was a far different grandfather to me than he was a father to my father and my aunties. I remember sitting at my grandfather's deathbed. I was around 17 or 18 years old. All of my grandfather's children were doing everything possible to convince my grandfather to accept Jesus in his last moments. A trusted friend of my auntie, a Christian pastor, came to visit my grandfather at the hospital. He asked my grandfather whether he would accept Jesus into his heart. And we were all hovering over the hospital bed, hanging on every word. And then my grandfather's head dropped, just a centimeter. Maybe not at all. Maybe it was just a shift in the light. But we all interpreted this slight movement as assent. I remember feeling that everyone thought this old, stubborn man had finally broken. For me, even as a teenager, I remember questioning whether my grandfather's slight head nod could truly be interpreted as a yes, or whether it was the nod of a man that was biting his tongue, desiring some peace and quiet. Or I wonder if he assented in that moment as a kindness to his children, knowing it would bring them peace. Whatever the case, when I have been lost during some of the loneliest moments in my career, I have suddenly felt my grandfather's spirit by my side. I don't know if he's stuck in some eternal purgatory, bereft of the freedom to enter the pearly gates, left to idle with the trifling problems of his descendants. But I can say that it has been a huge comfort to me to feel my grandfather's presence. I've dwelled on the sacrifices my grandfather made for my freedom to do what I will with my life, and it has given me backbone when I've needed it. As a queer Asian American, I have always proudly professed my faith in God and more broadly professed a belonging to the faith of Christianity. But as a queer Christian, I'm also seen as an oxymoron. My faith is perceived as lacking or non-existent. I feel that I'm seen as an imposter, and I feel like an imposter in many churches. I think about my grandfather. He survived the war, but when he returned to the United States, I don't think that he felt redeemed. He killed people to survive, and many of the men that he had served with died. I wonder if he lived out his life feeling like an imposter in this country, despite his many successes. I don't think that he ever found the rituals that he needed to lay his ghosts to rest. And similarly, when I think about Rahab, I wonder, she lived out the rest of her days among a people that had murdered everyone in her city. Even if Jericho was not her home, I imagined this shaking her spirit. Was Rahab able to mourn? Did she feel safe living among her conquerors? I have struggled with my queer identity being a source of shame to my family for years. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, my family was my rock. I could do no wrong in their eyes. But I quickly fell from the throne after I came out as gay. The protective covering of my clannish family was lifted, and I do feel that I was left to shoulder a pretty blistering sense of abandonment and isolation alone. I think that similar to my grandfather and maybe Rahab, I have just kept going. I have not stopped. Indeed, I think that I've thrown myself again and again against the gates of my family, never fully receiving the reciprocity I'm looking for. I think that I've just been unceasingly active instead of taking that space that I need to grieve. I think that in many ways I haven't felt that I could grieve. In the process of acculturating to this society, my family, and by extension, I, lost a lot of the rituals my ancestors engaged in to grieve. In his book, American Sutra, Buddhist priest and scholar Reverend Duncan Rilken Williams shares that before World War II, the majority of Japanese Americans were actually Buddhist. The majority of the 100th and 442nd battalions were Buddhist. And of course, mass incarceration was totalistic, but whether you identified as Buddhist or Christian mattered when you were sent to the concentration camps. Before the war broke out, merely being a Buddhist Shinto priest placed you on the list of suspected categories of people. And this was not so if you were a Christian minister. As a Buddhist, your very religion made you suspect. Once the war broke out and Japanese Americans were ordered to report to assembly centers, a policy was announced. No one could bring anything written in Japanese into the camps. Christian Bibles written in Japanese were allowed into the camps, and English-Japanese dictionaries were allowed. That is, the United States made clear through this policy that you would be considered more American if you could speak English and if you identified as a Christian. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, in 1942 and 1943, you see a number of conversions from Buddhism to Christianity within the camps. But then, in 1944, you see a returning surge in the number of Buddhist conversions. Reverend Williams posits that Japanese Americans were done playing the game of conformity. It wasn't working. They were still incarcerated, and so they returned to Buddhism, a religion that had provided solace and comfort to their ancestors for generations. Perhaps, also, this was a statement of resistance, that my ancestors felt that they could claim being Japanese and Buddhist and still fully American. And maybe, too, my ancestors needed to grieve, being bereft of country and home, and they needed to return to familiar practices and rituals that felt authentic in order to be able to grieve. I'm struggling to identify as Christian in this moment. I think that part of this is that mainstream Christianity does not recognize my grief. I recently learned the term disenfranchised grief, where societally we are told that our grief is unacceptable because it is not a loss at all. I have seen how the ways our families are structured tends to extend to the way we structure our churches. If families are dictated by a strict sense of hierarchy, the churches that these families attend often espouse and reflect the same norms. I struggle to name what it is about my sexual orientation that is so threatening to my family and to the Christian church at large. And I think at its root, it's that I'm challenging the structures of how we relate to each other. It is easier for my family and church family to let go of me than to see its entire structure questioned and maybe changed. We all prefer the preordained blueprint. No family wants to go through the process of wandering the desert. Many Asian American families survive because they do what is good for the whole, and when the prospect of the whole is threatened, it's easier to cut ties with the individual. My family and the church dismisses my pain because confronting it would mean acknowledging culpability. And so I have often grieved alone, sitting in my car in front of my parents' home, or up late at night, sitting on the side of my bed, muffling my cries. However, I will say that during these moments, I have felt the Spirit of God gently resting on my shoulder, whispering to me that He is still near and listening to my pain. The story of Rahab is complicated. How many of us, as people of color, have family stories of the woman that betrayed our town, our village, our people? It is always a woman that betrays. I wonder how Rahab reconciled saving her family in exchange for the destruction and death of so many. I wonder if she too wrestled with remorse and regret, whether she also lay awake at night, muffling her cries with her pillow. And I think that God heard her. In Matthew 1, Rahab reappears, and we find that she was an ancestor of Jesus. I love that at the beginning of Matthew, we have the lineage of Jesus laid out from Abraham. The majority of the women were excluded, but we see that Rahab is one of the few that was not. Why do you think that is? I think that it's because Rahab, even in the midst of her grief, thundered into the void, "I am worthy. My life, it is not disposable." So many of us have lost loved ones in the past weeks to COVID-19. We've lost loved ones to structural racism, sexism, xenophobia, classism, ableism, and homophobia, and transphobia. Maybe in our grief, we feel unheard and unseen because these recent losses only further build on the disappearance and erasure of people that look and believe like us. This past Monday, Chung Wong-an, a 74-year-old Korean man, died at the Mesa Verde Ice Processing Center in Bakersfield. Authorities say it was suicide. In detention, An was suffering from severe chest pain. He was hospitalized, but then returned to Mesa Verde, where he was placed under quarantine isolation. He begged to be released from isolation, but the officers would not hear him. An's attorney had previously submitted 3 different release requests, but all were denied because An had a conviction for attempted murder with a firearm. He had shot a gun at 2 men who had tried to come to the aid of the woman he was beating. ICE authorities and a federal district judge found An's dangerousness to be irredeemable despite his age and medical vulnerabilities. I think that as a society, we have a tendency to construe people as irredeemable once they have committed a crime. But An had already served his time in custody. He was being held in civil custody by ICE, so purely for reason of being an immigrant, the government murdered him. I sit with An's story, and this could have been my grandfather. My grandfather did not return from war a well man. He was violent in his home, and I wonder what would have happened if any of his victims had ever reported him. I wonder how that would have changed things if my grandfather had died, not on a hospital deathbed surrounded by his family, but in an isolated cell, feeling heard by no one. Yes, COVID-19 is a dangerous illness, but what is more dangerous is the callousness I am seeing reflected by our society, our lack of mercy and humility and humanity. I have seen this with my clients locked away in detention centers. The legal system continues to draw more and more finite lines dictating worthiness. If you're brown, you're not worthy. If you're a brown man, you're even less worthy. And if you're a brown man with a criminal record, you are the real danger here, not COVID-19. Better that you die of COVID-19, locked in a cage, than to expose society to your dangerousness. In this time when our own mortality is being waved in our faces, I think that one of the greatest tragedies is that we continue to divide the world along our self-created lies. It's easier to create a false sense of security for ourselves than to face how fragile our lives are and how close each of us is to death. We have forgotten that our own histories are far more complicated and that God exists there in the pain and the questions and the complicated stories. God does not exist in our false security and self-righteousness. Society
Amen.
stigmatized Rahab as a woman, a foreigner, a sex worker, even a betrayer. Yet Jesus was not ashamed of including Rahab in his heritage. In fact, it seems that pains were taken to include her. I imagine Jesus at his family dinner table among the holy hosts, dining with all of his ancestors. I imagine Rahab coming up in conversations and quick whispers and hushes to continue parts of Rahab's stories in quieter corners. And I imagine Jesus taking the brave step of intervening and insisting that Rahab's full story is told, that nothing about her life is irredeemable to the light. I think that this is also why my grandfather keeps coming back to me in my meditations. I think he welcomes this curious and introspective examination of his life. We do not talk about my grandfather much in my family. When you do such terrible things, the family is relieved when you pass. Old wounds have time to heal, and maybe that person is never discussed again. But I think there is so much that was redeemable about my grandfather. I want his life to be remembered, and I want to remember him in his complexity, not just for the heroic things that he did, but for the very human and very hurtful things that he did. All of it, the heroic and the broken, all of this is part of my inheritance. It's in my blood. It's part of who I am. As Kazu Haga says, if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and in our DNA. Our ancestors may not have had the ability or been at liberty to grieve, and maybe no one grieved for them during their time. Here's where we can offer them something in exchange for their wisdom. We can grieve. And even if our cultural grieving practices have been lost to us, that's okay. We can create new traditions. We can create new rituals. We can create interactive altars. We can paint murals. We can write poetry. We can cry and scream. We can create playlists. We can become lost in the way that the sky turns from orange to pink to purple to blue when the sun sets. We can eat comforting foods that remind us of home. We can share stories about our ancestors, and not just the easy parts. We can share the painful memories too.
Amen.
We can remember our ancestors in their entirety. And in this way, our own lives become less of a mystery. We can continue in dialogue with our ancestors through meditation and prayer. We can welcome them when they come to us in our dreams. We can hold each other. We can hold ourselves. We can sit in silence. We can sleep. We can write sermons with no end. No, I kid. This is the end. At the beginning of the sermon, I asked you to name an ancestor and to journey with them through this message. And what do they leave you with here at the conclusion? What grieving practices did you learn from them? What grieving practices can you offer them that you can share here as so many of us are grieving now? The end.
Amen.
Amen. So powerful.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you. That's
Thank
so
you.
generous. Thank you.
Good job. Good job.